I'm going to be taking you through some ways to think about how you need to change the culture and operation of your business in order to make the most out of the digital assets and move from this idea of management to exploitation. Because if we don't get into an exploitation mindset, we're not in a value creation mindset. And quite frankly, with interest rates now at 0.75%, if we want to start thinking about how are we going to put value back on the national balance sheet, we've got to seriously think about this question of exploitation. How do we build new value? How do we remunerate it? How do we create new centres of enduring value in our society and our economy? So that's the philosophy for the morning. So let's come back to this question of digital assets. The grand divide, you've got to start thinking of devices and services separately to systems and data. What actually drives your business? What drives your organisation? What drives the market opportunity that you are pursuing? So I'll just swap hats for a second and go back to being a wills and estates lawyer for a minute. Okay, so you're advising a trustee, you're advising an executive, you're advising an attorney. What are you actually responsible for? Duty number one, what are the devices and services that this person is actually connected to? The prosaic reality of this is we think of our mobile phones. My mother-in-law is 93, lives on her own. Oh, Michael, I'm having a problem with my internet banking. Would you mind helping me? Sit down to her computer. Oh, Cynthia, can I have your password? Boom. One password, and I see all her life, every bank account, every term deposit, every investment, and I've got complete access at that point. Security, power, that's just the keys to the front of the kingdom. Whoever holds the mobile phone, whoever has that password, has the key to the economic power for that person. Has anyone heard about the consumer data right that has been legislated? We now have, thanks to Commonwealth legislation, a consumer data right. Do you know who's enforcing it? ACCC. Do you know the first application for the consumer data right? The right for someone to take all their data from their bank and move it from bank A to bank B. All the data. We have moved beyond passwords and having the keys to the front door to going, no, I've now got the ability to take my whole data set from bank A to bank B. What does that do to fraud, economic power, someone being able to impersonate and take your financial assets? Well, I hope you trust them. It brings a whole new area of risk. So what is the significance of a person's total data at their bank? For tax, for business. So just at a very personal level now, we have to start thinking about, as individuals, how do we manage the data that defines our activities? Yes, I'm a private client lawyer. Yes, I've got clients in NDIS. Do you realise how much information you have to accumulate around a client to manage the NDIS plan reviews? Who's going to do that for them? Who's going to do that with them? Is the client actually capable of managing the escalating amount of data around themselves? If that's not a business opportunity, I don't know what is. So we need to start thinking as professionals, okay, what is our role to help clients transact the complexity around their lives? So devices are reasonably easy. They're tangible things. Yes, they're property. Yes, they've got security concerns. Yes, you've got to be careful. The Internet of Things is really interesting. Go and Google Sophie Hub, S-O-F-I, one word, Hub, H-U-B. It's an AI-driven business, based in Melbourne, and it's got a system of sensors. So Norik touched on this with the graphene underlying the carpet. And what Sophie Hub does is turn your home into a surveilled environment. And it will build up a pattern. So we touched on the significance of patterns. The pattern of how you live in your house. When do you go to the laundry? When do you go to the kitchen? When do you go to the bathroom? And it will send an alert if your pattern diverges, if your actual usage diverges from the pattern. What are we doing? We're creating a safer environment for people to age in place. Right. So who owns the data? Think of that as a privacy problem. No, we've got mum at home with maybe a couple of carers, and we've got the data that's being built up around her conduct in order to support her safety. Who should have access to that? We're just going to throw it off into a server somewhere in the internet. Big data has as one of its big advantages to government automated decisions and behavioural assessment. Oh, okay. So what patterns of walking around the house, turning on the lights, what valuable behaviours can be derived from all that data that's being accumulated out of that life of that individual? How do we fix it? How do we protect it? How do we use it? This is starting to become a very intimate problem. Data management is part of how we live as individuals. It's not just a business problem. Now, would we like to add personal electronic health records? The great, just throwing your medical records onto the end of your Medicare record. Okay. How wise is that? Wouldn't it be better to be managing that data from a personal point of view? And yet we have all the quite a range of decisions that says, sorry, doctor's note to the property of the doctor, not the property of the individual. So we need to start thinking about systems and data. It's not just about what accounts do we have, Office 365, Dropbox, iCloud, but what communities are we part of? LinkedIn, YouTube, Facebook. Well, we've already given the exploitation rights in Facebook away to Facebook, but I've just in the process of changing my GP to one of these newfangled GP wellness places that actually looks quite interesting. But I'm no longer a patient, I'm a member. And yes, I will get to see a doctor, but then there are going to be accumulating fitness information, personal and lifestyle information, choices about wellness objectives. Wait a second, I thought I was just going to the doctor. Now, what are the rules around managing that? Then, okay, where is all this stuff going to be stored? And we come back to Lee Sager's problem of all these software as a services are basically governed by contracts. Does your attorney, does your executor, does your trustee, your guardian have the legal right to continue to operate those contracts in the event of your disability? That's very much a situation on a case-by-case basis. So we need to think, okay, when we're starting to assess the extent of what a person or a business owns or controls, we need to dive a lot deeper than we used to. Because if we don't understand what we have and what we don't understand what we can control, we don't understand how to exploit. This is ground zero, understanding this landscape at a personal or business level. And then working out, right, what is significant? Lee made a very good point about the ephemeral nature of information. We live in a sea of information. We make decisions continually. We can't control every aspect of information that surrounds us. What we have to do is make judgments about what is significant, what are the significant things that I need to continue to assert control over to preserve value. The aging of ethics teaches us that you need to ask yourself, what does my younger self owe my older self? What are the decisions I can make today that's going to make it easier for me and my successors later? Making decisions about what is significant and the elements of control, as I said, ground zero. There's a lot of discussion about ethics. Okay, if we've got all this stuff, what does ethical use of your digital life and digital assets and digital legacy actually look like? Well, ethics is really just the mechanics and science of human decision making. So we want to act right in the first place. We want to impress on the people that represent our interests that only particular types of conduct are going to be acceptable. What do we have to align to have that result? Values, purpose, and principles. Quite simple. Community becomes important because that's what aligns our values in terms of what are we expecting. How do we... So common values around the recognition, preservation and purpose of data, devices, our digital life, our digital legacy. That's where the Society of Trust and Estate Practitioners has been doing a lot of work internationally in building that common vocabulary. So for all of you who are STEP members, please have a look at the resources that are there within the Digital Asset Special Interest Group, because that gives you initial practical guidance of where do we start in applying consistent professional practice to these problems. What we've had from Lee this morning is a very good summary of the principles that we need to start to applying, to recognising what we need to manage. What we're going to focus on now is purpose. For what purpose are we expending energy and resources? At one level, we want to make money if we're in business, but as private individuals, we want to have safety in the operation of our affairs. So what are the things we can do to produce that safer operation of our affairs against all this change that is happening? So there's been quite a lot of work done in the world that has resulted in reports over the last 9 months or so around artificial intelligence and ethics. I was part of a policy lab by the New South Wales government a couple of weeks ago. And we had people from the Australian Computer Society, and Microsoft was there, IBM was there, Hewlett-Packard was there, the normal suspects in terms of government policy. And they had a dozen questions on butcher's paper around the wall, and the most consistent theme around all the questions that were asked and all the responses What does ethics mean in the management of data? No one had any resolved answers, but we do have to start to build up a consistency of expectation. And the reports basically ask us to think of how are we going to do the following things. In terms of values, they say, well, okay, if we're going to have data and we're going to be, and don't forget, AI is driven by data. So the quality of the data, how it's going to be used, and for what purpose it's going to be used. Well, first value, we do no harm. Second, protect privacy. But wait a second. Think of Sophie Hub. In order to have increased care at home, in order to stay at home longer, I need to transact my privacy for someone to have access to my behaviours to create a safer environment for me to live. So privacy is becoming a transactable commodity. What do our business models around that look like? Provide contestability. Now, what does that mean? If I'm going to be using your data and you don't agree with what I'm doing, you should be able to contest what I'm doing. That also means that if I'm going to be using your data, I should be able to explain what I'm doing. Now, anyone who's got a background in AI understands that any data set has a bias in it. First problem. Second problem, the deeper machine learning goes, the harder it is to explain what the machine is doing. So how do we provide contestability? How do we, as lawyers, we're used to having judicial or administrative review of decisions. We are used to looking for and explaining the assumptions which underlie a decision. In this AI-driven world, that is going to get harder and harder and harder. How do we preserve natural justice in an environment where deep learning is going to get more pervasive in our lives? And provide accountability to purpose. Well, that's essentially what privacy law is about. Confidentiality is about enforcing a behaviour that data will only be used for the purpose for which it's given. So the values are reasonably easy, but what principles do we need to apply to support that? Well, we've got to be clear about what benefits are we actually creating through the management of the data. So we want to exploit data for what purpose? By what process do we understand the net benefits we intend to create? So don't forget Sophie Hub. The net benefit they're creating is a safer environment and keeping you at home longer. That's okay. Am I prepared to trade my privacy for that? Yep. Am I prepared to pay money for it? Yep. And not only are the private homeowners starting to buy from them, so are the institutions, so are the aged care homes, so are the hospitals, so that as we institutionalise our people as we age, the built environment is becoming cognition and behaviour responsive. So it's taking the idea of an intelligent building to quite a different level. So just the mere fact of living, we're generating data off our personal activities that we won't necessarily directly control. How do we mitigate harm against that? I realise I'm asking more questions. The purpose of this morning is to be a provocation. This isn't about resolving these issues. It's about putting a framework around these activities so that we can start to navigate or help people navigate these choices in a reasonably safe way and understand the downside of what can't necessarily be controlled at the moment. Complying with the law and regulation. There's a really interesting example here with just normal financial services today. We have the Financial Planning Code of Conduct. It's actually a legislative instrument under the Corporations Act. The financial planners are told you must comply with the Code of Conduct. The first principle of the Code of Conduct, you must comply with the law. Okay, that's fine. Second principle, you must have the informed consent of your client to everything that you do. Yeah? Okay. So you're the Commonwealth Bank and you want to bring robo-advice and chatbots into the retail client environment. Would someone please explain to me how they can write an ethical algorithm? How are you going to do informed consent if you're going to put a chatbot as your primary interface to a banking client onboarding system? What does informed consent look like in that AI-driven world? Now, there is elements of this that are only going to be solved by legislation or helped by legislation. What we've got to start thinking about is what are the practices that we need to adopt that help people start to navigate these choices with a bit more deliberation and a bit more safety. The role of STEP is to be a source of advocatable good practice, and the more we can bring this back into the community of STEP and use our community of practice as a way of normalising vocabulary, process and action, the safer we make it, we make practice for everyone. Be fair. Well, what does that mean? Good question. We could spend the rest of the day just debating that. But some connection between generating benefits, providing accountability and doing no harm probably gives you a starting point for how do we approach that problem. Be transparent and explainable. Well, that's going to be the bugbear of the AI-driven system administrators for the next 100 years. We've just got to keep on working on that. And make yourself subject to informed consent. Informed consent in this AI-driven world is probably our biggest threshold issue. And against this is the practical reality that between the ages of 50 and 80, the statistics are about 1 in 3 people is going to be affected by mild cognitive impairment in one form or another. So with those kind of stats, and you're building a business system, you're running a client onboarding operation, how are you going to deal with getting informed consent in a safe way that responds to the cognitive state of the client? So the follow-on event from this in STEP is a symposium in Sydney on the 23rd of October, which is focused on the impact of ageing on professional responsibility. But in this digital asset AI-driven world, yes, as we build our systems, as we build our processes, as we build our web and AI and cloud-based systems, making sure that people understand the consequence of their action in dealing with the system that you are putting out there is going to be a continuing business requirement. We touched on consumer law earlier. When you think about all the vagaries of this, consumer law tells us that once you establish someone has a special disadvantage, you have a higher duty of care to the consumer. We're all in business in one way or another. We're all subject to competition and consumer law. We have no guidance at the moment on do these uncertainties mean that we have a systemic risk around people not being able to understand, not being able to cope, therefore being at a special disadvantage. Therefore, well, okay, who's going to get harmed? So and my bet is, all of this is going to come up to review very, very quickly as the Reserve Bank switches on its open banking. We have a consumer data right alive in the world, and people start getting ripped off by their family and attorneys with elder financial abuse. I think that's going to be the biggest landscape for testing, for stress testing these principles in the short term. What happens next? We'll wait and see. So, let's go a bit further in this idea of purpose. For what purpose are you creating or holding these assets? Now, if you have built an operating system for your business, say be it a trading system, as a lot of fintech do, your system is enabling infrastructure for your business. Okay, so actually, how it's the equivalent of physical plant and infrastructure. Now, taxation accounting alone is not going to give you the accounting constructs to be able to identify the significance of that asset in the operation of your business. Something for you to think about is that, okay, if we're in business ultimately to sell our business, how do we manage the recognition of the systems which are a going concern element of the enterprise? A very simple question to ask yourself is that if I sell my business tomorrow, what do I have to hand over to a purchaser for that purchaser to succeed to the operation of my business? And it's at that point that we start to see the currency exchanges are the entities that monitor the exchange of value between the wild and woolly west of Bitcoin and the conventional finance system. So I had someone say to me, send me an email last week, oh Michael, I've just had my first client admit that they have Bitcoin. Where is it? Oh, it's held by the trustee of the self-managed super fund. First question, how did the auditor bring Bitcoin on the balance sheet of the super fund? Second question, what knowledge does the trustee have of how it's going to control that asset? Let alone the underlying issue, can Bitcoin be recognised as property of a trust? It's property for taxation and by Treasury policy. But what measure of control is required by the trustee in order for it to be recognised as property of the trust? So, if we're going to have ethical use and control of digital assets, where do we have to start to land our thinking? First is actually in the governance of whatever enterprise is controlling the digital asset. It might be an individual, family, business, government. So as a matter of governance, what do you control? How are you accountable for privacy in what you control? What is fair or permitted use of what you control? How do you explain how data is to be used? You know, Think of those founding principles up the front. How do you get informed consent to the use of data? What are the limits of the assumption of capacity? This is the Achilles heel, which we'll touch on. I've had a number of elder lawyers turn around to me and say, oh, look, Michael, why do we need to worry about supported decision making? We have the assumption of capacity. But a significant market is the clients that are aged between, say, 50 and 80. If 1 out of 3 is going to have mild cognitive impairment, how useful is a blind faith in the assumption of capacity? The reality is we have an aging population. So how we engage with our clients, how we deal with complexity of decision making, how we engage clients to our offering in commerce or business is a critical business risk. And the one thing we can't do, in my view, is have just a blind faith in the blanket application of the assumption of capacity. Already in New South Wales, we have the case of Ryan and Dalton, which set 70 as an age-based trigger for capacity assessment. But if you're in a Commonwealth-funded hospital and you present, and I kid you not, in confusion, the hospital is required to capacity test if you're over the age of 60. Now, how many 60-year-olds think of themselves as impaired individuals? Come on. So what's the relevance of age-based triggers in all of this? Good question. What's the relevance of the assumption of capacity in an aging population? Well, it's starting to get dangerous. So what does early intervention look like in terms of being the cognitive responsive workplace worker or in producing client outcomes? So if we don't become cognitive responsive in how we engage with people in normal society, we are just leaving an enormous area of risk and liability open to us. So governance, how do you assert control? There's a set of criteria that we could spend the rest of the day on. So business outcome, what do we want to do? We want to improve the transactability of our business. So you first got to make sure that you understand what you have possession of, how you control transfer, and then when you can do those two things effectively in your enterprise, then you can set price. We're starting to see how this characteristic of property can be built out of how you control your digital assets. But if you don't have the governance and operational infrastructure to assert authority and control, you have no hope of improving the transactability of those elements of your enterprise. And please, 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 beware of the interval of legal mayhem. We are in an aging population, and we understand dementia is a healthcare priority. We understand normal aging can keep people cognitively intact and functioning and autonomous up until, well, in my father-in-law's case, up to his 100th birthday. He was only ill for a week before he died, but he got to his 100th birthday, and that was great. How we police this left-hand line and then become responsive to cognitive impairment in both function and decision-making deficits, and saying, okay, because government policy is basically saying, well, this is what we need to manage in order to reduce the incidence of abuse of authority and powers of attorney and guardianship and substitute decision making. So in business, we need to think, okay, what kind of market does that mild cognitive impairment group actually represent? How concerned do we need to be about it? This needs to be part of our thinking and how we manage these new forms of assets. Thank you very much.